It's kind of funny that a Star Trek parody teaches us more about our own society than most of the media. Big statement, I know, but the Orville imagines us, humanity, in the 25th century, and in this future, life is better for everyone. They've moved beyond disease, needless suffering, and even scarcity. And there's this one episode that actually shows us how we might get that future, and even fix what I think will go down in history as the biggest moral failure of our time: factory farming. But without actually compromising on what we eat. The story starts here, in space, with the Orville ship exploring new worlds when the crew receive a distress call from another Union ship.
Go down there and help
Much
out.
better. Great. So we'll see you in a bit, okay?
And so the captain, Ed, and the first officer, which coincidentally is also his ex-wife, Kelly, take their shuttle over to see what's going on. But when they arrive, the ship just vanishes. And so do they. The crew scramble to figure out what's going on, but they quickly realize that this other ship was a projection, a very technologically advanced fake designed to lure Ed and Kelly in, into a very strange place that tells us a lot. Suddenly, they find themselves here.
It's our old apartment.
This is impossible.
Yeah, so somehow Ed and Kelly are back in their old New York City apartment, and at first they think they've been sent back in time or something. I mean, everything is just like they remember it. Well, except for one crucial thing. They can't actually leave.
Kel, where the hell are we?
So without any ideas yet, they fall back on the one thing that humanity has done better than anything else for millennia.
So, what do we do now?
Survival.
Survival, yeah. But in this future, survival looks a bit different. You see, in this time, humanity has solved the issue of scarcity. And throughout the show, we see this time and time again. This is a matter synthesizer, a basically magic device that can literally synthesize any food you want.
1 shot of slain tequila.
1 cannabis edible.
Oh my God, seriously?
500 cigarettes.
Okay, I swear they also use it for regular food. The point is, they've moved beyond the old ways of producing stuff like food, the ways that we still rely on today, like, farming crops or animals. But even though this looks a lot like magic, what's interesting is that we actually have a similar technology in our world right now. I know it sounds, like sci-fi, but part of why it might sound so crazy is that we're not really talking about it in the ways we should. And we're not, in some sense, even allowed to use it. And that actually has to do more with our values and our economics than with the actual science. So let me explain what I mean and how we can get this future we see in the Orville sooner than you might think. Defeated in their escape, Ed and Kelly eventually hit the hay. But when they wake up again, they finally realize what's happening here.
Hey, can you tell me where I am? Because honestly...
Mama, I want to see the Mocklins.
If we have time, come on, let's go.
It turns out they're in a zoo, but it's an alien zoo and they're the animals. Naturally, they're confused, but then their neighbors kindly fill them in on the gravity of their situation.
What the hell kind of people do something like this?
They're Calivan. They think any technologically inferior species is theirs to do with as they please.
We're interesting and fun to watch. Weird as that sounds.
And here's where Kelly brings up something quite interesting.
It's not that weird. There was a time when humans imprisoned animals for entertainment. It wasn't intended to be cruel, we just felt as the higher species we had the right.
Yeah, well, that was hundreds of years ago, so you tell me who's more advanced. Hey!
Right, so the Calivan don't actually see themselves as monsters. They even think of themselves as, incredibly advanced and intelligent. But still, to the Calivan, humans and these other weird dudes, well, they're just kind of exhibits, interesting creatures for them to observe for entertainment. Now, I don't bring this up to discuss the ethics of animal zoos in our time, because even though it's shocking to see some of the things happening in our zoos, I think there's actually a much better comparison that we should make here. And full disclosure, this isn't about converting anyone to veganism, even though I really respect it. Every year, humanity raises and slaughters 80 billion animals, mostly in factory farms. If you compare that to the number of humans that have ever lived, that's 117 billion. So it takes us just a year and a half to slaughter as many animals as the amount of humans that ever lived. And it's just a few species. If you take all of the wild animals that walk the earth right now, and you put them on a scale next to our livestock, well, they weigh 30 times less. And in some ways it makes a lot of sense. Livestock provides a lot of protein to feed our hungry world. But of course, and this is just an uncomfortable truth, these animals that do very much feel things, well, they have a terrible life from the day they're born until the day they die. And warning here, this next little part might be a bit hard to hear. You can skip ahead to this timestamp if you prefer to avoid it, but honestly, I think it's good to be reminded. Take chickens. The modern chicken industry has bred birds to grow so fast that their legs literally can't support their own weight. So when they're 5 to 6 weeks old, they struggle just to stay alive. And for the breeding birds that need to live longer, the only way to keep them alive with these genetics is to feed them only about 30% of what they actually want to eat. That means these chickens spend their whole life starving. And in the egg farms, as for their babies, well, if they're males, they just get blended or gassed immediately the day they're born because they can't lay eggs. Then there's pigs. The breeding pigs in factory farms live in small metal crates they can't turn around in. They basically spend their whole life like this, lying on concrete floors above their own excrement. Pigs that are smarter than most of our pets. Even in the best regulated factory farms in the world, that would be in places like New Zealand that, has some semblance of animal welfare laws, these things still happen. For example, in one farm in New Zealand, word came out about this. Pigs are supposed to be stunned on a conveyor belt before they're slaughtered. But oftentimes, this stunning fails. And so the pig in this case will just continue down the belt anyway while it's still conscious. And that means it's fully aware when it's dropped into a vat of boiling water that's supposed to make it easier to remove its skin for processing. And keep in mind, this is an example from one of the most humane factory farms in the world. The point is, there's a huge amount of suffering going on here, and we actually only know very little about it. What I mean is that most of the info and footage that we actually have from these farms, well, it comes from undercover investigators. And these investigators have only visited less than 1% of all factory farms. But quite tellingly, they always seem to find some terrible thing going on. And it's not only about the animals either. As far as the people who work on these farms, no surprise, I guess, but it's pretty bad too. One former Tyson Foods employee, that's one of the big corporations, his name is Virgil Butler. He became a whistleblower all the way back in 2003 because, as he put it, quote, he didn't wish to be part of the nightmare any longer. That would be the nightmare of hearing thousands of chickens, pigs, or cows screaming for their life day in and day out while you're administering the pain. And good for him for whistleblowing, but Virgil is a rare example. Usually the people who work in these farms aren't making that much money, and they're often in precarious situations. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone either, but that means that they can't actually talk about what's happening inside the farms. You see, their employers, which are huge corporations like Tyson Foods or Purdue, well, they have these ag-gag laws in place, which makes it illegal to film or even talk about what's going on inside their factory farms. And that means, no one on minimum wage or less wants to risk losing their income check or even getting sued to expose animal welfare issues. It's a simple equation for them. Putting food on the table for your family or getting sued by a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Now, I should also add that most of the meat that these workers help produce is pumped full of weird and unhealthy shit too. I always find it funny when people say they're following the paleo diet, but then they just eat factory farm chicken all day. But that really isn't something that our ancestors were eating. This sort of chicken is, pumped full of growth-promoting antibiotics and hormones that we don't even fully understand the health effects of. But it turns out, when you give these animals these meds and hormones, they're more resistant to diseases and they grow faster. And so you can produce a lot more meat at a lot lower price point. And just to be clear here, factory farming has made meat production insanely cheap. And of course, it's crazy profitable because of that. But the bottom line is that all comes at the cost of animal suffering, horrible working conditions, unknown health effects, and the list actually goes on. It's actually one of those rare industries that's just terrible on all fronts. For example, it's also really bad for our environment. It's causing antibiotic resistance in humans, and it's probably the leading cause of another potential pandemic. Anyway, I think most people watching this probably know some of this stuff already. But what's interesting here is that despite all these terrible things, global meat consumption is rising and is projected to keep rising for the foreseeable future. And to be sure, the vast majority of meat we eat is factory farmed. In the US, for example, it makes over 99% of meat consumption. Meat is cultural at this point. It's not something people can, easily let go of. I mean, most people eat meat, but that in itself is also kind of interesting because at the same time, most people are also against factory farming. It's actually one of the few things that we can all agree on despite our political differences. For example, a recent survey in the US found that 70 to 85% of people are against these practices. And that number is higher across Europe. I think this number reflects something important. Most of us don't feel good about how we're treating animals. And if it came down to it, I think most of us would rather skip the meat if it meant that we had to, personally torture, say, a pig for its whole life to get it on our plate. But of course, we don't have to do that. We just get the pig as pork in a neat package in the supermarket. But that means that there's this disconnect, right? Between how people really feel about factory farming, how it's harming our world, and then what we actually do about it. But that disconnect in itself isn't actually all that accidental. There's a reason that we haven't moved towards more ethical ways of producing food. And that includes using technology to produce meat without suffering. And while we're still on the issues surrounding factory farming's impact on the world, I want to briefly mention something that you're probably also thinking I haven't talked about enough. The environmental aspect. Of course, factory farming isn't just an animals' rights issue. It's one of the leading drivers of deforestation too. This is especially true for our biggest forest, the Amazon, which is being cut down at an insane rate to make way for livestock and the crops that feed them. So what can we do? Because, as individuals, we can change our diets and reduce waste and stuff like that, but the scale of deforestation in places like the Amazon, well, it requires collective action too. That's why I joined Planet Wild, and I'm very happy to team up with them again for this video. Planet Wild is basically crowdfunding, but for nature. Every month, a community of over 20,000 members funds a new mission to restore our environment, and you can become a member too. Their missions range from protecting endangered species, cleaning oceans, to restoring forests, including funding a mission to the Amazon. And Planet Wild does on-the-ground work, documenting everything they do on their YouTube channel, so you can actually see what your money is doing. Their Amazon mission is backed by indigenous communities who help protect the forest from the bottom up. Funding that mission gives the people who've been living in that ecosystem for generations the resources to keep going. I think helping the people here is the way to go on an issue like this. If you want to help do that and join Planet Wild to help support one of their missions, the first 100 people to sign up using my code MARCUS3 will get their first month for free. Just scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the description. And of course, it goes without saying, you can cancel anytime. If you use my code, you also directly support me in making more videos like this. It's really a win-win, seriously. So a big thanks to Planet Wild for teaming up with me on this video. And if you want to see them in action, go check out their Amazon mission below. Before we find out what happens to Ed and Kelly in the zoo, there's actually another episode I want to mention first. In this episode, the helmsman of the Orville, Gordon, great character by the way, he accidentally gets sent back in time to 2015. That's to our recent past, right? But keep in mind that it's 400 years before the timeline of the Orville. And as it turns out, Gordon ends up spending quite a lot of time here. When the crew finally finds him, it's only been a few hours for them, but for Gordon it's been more than 10 years since he got stuck on old Earth in our society. Obviously that sucks for him, but not just because it's a really long time, it also sucks because the Union, the organization behind the Orville, has this law in place in case something like this happens. It goes like this. If you should somehow be sent back in time, the rule is not to change anything. Make yourself as invisible as possible so you don't alter the course of history or something like that. Now, ignoring the time travel implications of this, there's this super interesting scene where Gordon describes those first years that he spent here in our time.
I spent 3 years obeying the law. I hid in an abandoned cabin in the woods of Connecticut, and I did my goddamn duty. I stayed invisible. I didn't see anyone. I didn't go anywhere.
And here's the part that really stuck with me.
You know what I ate? Animals. Yeah. I was holding my weapon when I got sent back, and I used it to kill animals. You want to talk about breaking the law? Here, it's no big deal, but in our time, I'm a serial murderer, folks. You know what that does to your head?
Gordon's speech here reveals a lot about how far their society has come. Gordon thinks of himself as a serial murderer. Killing animals seems like something very torturous to him. In their society, they think about killing animals just like we might think about bloodletting or something like that. Like back when we used to tap people for blood. That was literally the frontier of medical science not too long ago. Or they think about killing animals like how we look back on slavery from our own time. And part of the reason why is because the slaughter of animals for food is, just completely unnecessary because of the matter synthesizer. And in that way, it's also extremely unethical too. Now, before we get into the tech in our world, I feel like I have to, briefly mention that a lot of people already have a similar view to Gordon today. That it's just plain wrong to kill animals when we know about alternative ways of producing enough food to feed the hungry world without actually factory farming, like relying on plant-based diets. If everyone stopped eating factory farm meat, we'd fix a lot of the issues that I just mentioned earlier, including animal suffering. We'd have less meat to eat for sure, but it is possible for us to survive like this. And while I completely agree with that point, I want to take a slightly different angle here. Because even though we've known about these issues for a really long time, still, most people continue to eat factory farm meat anyway. I think the uncomfortable truth here is that it's bigger than ever, despite what we know or what we might feel about the industry. And you can argue that it's because, meat just tastes really good or that it's super cheap, but I think it actually goes a lot deeper than that. This disconnect that we were talking about before, it isn't by accident, right? And it's actually holding us back from using technology too that would allow us to eat meat without factory farming. For a long time now, there's been a concerted effort by the meat lobby to try to take our minds off and even normalize this kind of suffering going on in factory farms. For example, every time some new scandal emerges about animal welfare, which might be problematic for the industry in some way, well, they have a pretty good game plan. They literally just put a different label on their package, and it works. For example, not too long ago, a lot of countries regulated putting chickens in individual cages. And so when that happened, corporations like Purdue slapped a big fat cage-free sticker on their products. Sounds pretty good, right? Except for, it turns out, they released the chickens from individual cages, but then they just bunched them together in these farms instead. And so for us browsing the supermarket, even though these farms don't look too nice, as you can see here, hey, we don't see it and it says cage-free now. Anyway, there are a bunch of these examples. In the US, that includes labels like these, but this is what they actually mean. And these other labels don't even have legal definitions. Feel free to pause the video here. Now, outside the industry, this sort of thing is called humane washing. Labels like these are literally designed to have us not think about all the horrors going on behind the scene, and it totally works. Corporations like Purdue don't really want us to think too much about the suffering they cause to animals, and so They manufacture this disconnect and even make us feel like we're being responsible by putting these misleading labels on their products. It's even one of the reasons for why the industry lobbies our governments so hard. So according to Open Secrets, agri-services, which is mainly made up by the meat industry, well, it spent over $220 million on lobbying in the US in 2025 alone. That's almost double of what the tech lobby spent that year. And part of that money goes towards smart people trying to convince politicians that animal welfare facts concerning these labels are fake. As one lobbyist put it to the European Commission, these scientists with their high-level expertise have overlooked the facts and provide instead their own opinions on what they thought might be the case. Yeah, damn scientists, am I right? Notorious for providing their own opinion. No, but even if this sounds stupid to you, it doesn't matter that much, because a bunch of the politicians who are supposed to be regulating this stuff are just straight up in on the game. For example, and this is a crazy one, this dude, Tom Vilsack, used to be the governor of the largest factory farming state in the US, Iowa. And that credential got Obama to nominate him as Secretary of Agriculture in the US. Then, after he finished his term, he went to work as a lobbyist for the dairy industry. And then, that was literally the credential that got Biden to renominate him as Secretary of Agriculture. Seriously, what the actual fuck? No, but actually, one thing I am wondering about now is, how did the future society of the Orville ever manage to overcome this powerful industry? You know, with their smart marketing, lobbying, and super cheap profitable meat. Is it all just because of the matter synthesizer? Well, as it turns out, it's complicated. Because, like I said before, we pretty much have similar technology today. In the Orville, they've moved beyond capitalism. We see that in another episode. And don't worry, I promise we'll get back to Ed and Kelly and the Sioux. Don't forget about them. But we do have to talk about technology first. If you saw my other video on post-capitalism in the Orville, you might remember this. There's this great scene where they pick up a person from a less advanced world. A world that's pretty similar to ours, actually. This is Lysella. And on her planet, they face issues like poverty, corruption, and resource scarcity. Hey, that's just like our world. But Lysella gets picked up by accident, and so it would be policy to send her back to her own world again. But now that she's seen everything, the crew offers her a chance to stay and live on the ship. Sounds pretty awesome to me. But it turns out Lysella has a bit of a conscience. After learning about the matter synthesizer, she can't stop thinking about, how it might help her own world. And so she wants to bring one back for her own people.
Just this could change the world back on my planet. Even just one of these synthesizer things. Why couldn't you help them? Why couldn't you share your technology? I mean, there are whole countries that barely have clean water. This could save millions of lives.
And billions of lives of animals too, of course. But then Kelly comes with an answer that seems kind of weird at first.
Well, for one thing, it's against the law. We're not allowed to drop advanced technology into a developing society like bestowing a gift from heaven. In fact, that's how our justice system regards it, like playing God. Trust me, it never goes well.
But why, Lysella thinks? Why not help a society in need when it's so easy? She can't let that thought go. And so she starts to feel guilty, and that guilt eventually builds up to the point that she decides to leave the Orville and return home to her own planet anyway. But as Lysella gets on the ship to go back, an alarm goes off, and Kelly seems to know what's going on. She asks Lysella to see her bag, and for good reason. In it, she's caught with blueprints for how to create the matter synthesizer. And this is where things get particularly interesting. You might be thinking the same thing as Lysella, right? Why can't she help her own world? The answer to all of her society's problems are basically right there.
Come with me. I want to show you something.
So Kelly leads Lysella to an environmental simulator and shows her the answer. The simulator depicts real events that happened on another planet where society at the same developmental stage as Lysella's once flourished. But on this planet, the Union introduced advanced technology before the planet's society was ready for it. And when they got it, it didn't go so well for them.
Nation-states fought each other. Wars broke out everywhere because they all wanted to use the advancements for personal gain and for political dominance. They wiped themselves out in 5 years. 9 billion people. Gone.
I think Kelly is right here about needing systemic change, and we see that very clearly in our own world with factory farming and technology that could solve it. What she says actually reminds me about a debate that we've been having for decades, about how we might solve some of the pressing issues of our time, like world hunger or climate change, or factory farming, of course. I'm sure you've probably thought about it too. It basically goes like this. Do we as a society try to, or simply develop new technology to get us out of the hole that we've dug for ourselves? Or should we instead focus on behavioral and structural change and focus on the solutions that already exist and to some extent that we know works? Techno-optimism versus pessimism, right? Now, I'm not usually for the whole future technology will save us perspective. I mean, why should we gamble on our future when we have ways to actually fix things with the current technology? But Kelly makes an interesting point here, that the two positions might actually go hand in hand. I mean, her point is that we can only develop and responsibly use technology of this caliber if we're ready for it. Responsibly being the key word here. And as it turns out, in our case, she's absolutely right. In our world, we do have technology that's remarkably similar or close to the Orville's matter synthesizer. Yes, I'm finally gonna talk about it. Sorry it took me so long. Okay, so it has different names like cellular agriculture or brewing microbes, but let's just call it lab-grown meat. It's basically the process of growing real meat from animal cells in a lab. Now, I don't want to get too much into the science here, but rest assured, and this is the important bit, it already works. For example, in 2020, the company Good Foods received regulatory approval in Singapore to sell their cultivated chicken. And in 2023, both Good Meat and another company, Upside Foods, got FDA and USDA approval in the US. You can eat lab-grown meat in restaurants right now. That's pretty big. A recent paper in the journal ACS Food Science and Technology even suggests that brewing microbes to create meat proteins could be as transformative as humanity's shift from hunter-gatherer societies to agriculture societies. The point is, we might be on the verge of a food revolution as significant as the invention of farming itself, and we already have the technology to make it happen. Okay, it's not quite matter synthesizer stuff, but it's good, and it could change the world if we use it on a global scale. This could end factory farming. So why isn't it everywhere? Why are factory farms still the main way we feed our societies? Well, this is where the real issue comes in. And if you know me, you might be able to figure out what I think it is. It's something I love to talk about. Good old capitalism, baby. And that's a good as plug as any to ask for your support. I hate to do this, but it's just part of the YouTube game. Just by liking this video, you make my future videos possible. It gives a huge boost to the algorithm, and even more so if you subscribe, if you want to see more, of course. And if you want to engage more, I also have a Patreon page where you can get access to our community Discord, where we discuss a lot of these issues. I want to give a special thanks to Flaky, as always, and Emperor Vias and Louis Rebillard too. That was such a bad pronunciation. I'm sorry, man. And thanks so much to the other patrons who support the channel there. Before we find out what happens to Ed and Kelly, I start every time like that. And I know I'm drawing it out. Well, we gotta talk about why we're not using this amazing technology. So just like in Lacella's world, it's pretty clear that we don't have the social infrastructure in place, like the values and the economic system, to make this kind of technology have a real impact yet. We've gone into the values already, but as you might also be thinking by now, the bigger problem that in some sense defines our values lies with our economic system. So the main technical challenge with lab meat that we face today is that it's just too expensive to use on a global scale, to produce at scale. And pair that with the fact that factory farming is insanely cheap, it's just really hard for this tech to compete. So getting lab meat to work at scale is really important. That's the main challenge. But to do that, we need to be investing in it so we can start developing cheaper systems. I mean, that's just basic economics, right? But guess what? We're not in any meaningful way anyway. I know, big surprise, right? Like, wow, we aren't investing in actual helpful projects, but instead giving handouts to companies like Tyson Foods and Purdue. But only a few years ago, back in 2021 and 2022, things were actually looking pretty good for us.
More likely than not, lab-grown meat will be on your dinner plate in the near future.
Back then, we had a lot of venture capital going into lab-grown meat projects. And venture capital is basically private companies trying to make some money with their money by investing in startups, right? And so in 2021 and 22, venture capitalists invested a total of $1.3 billion into lab-grown meat companies. That's actually quite a lot. I mean, it's not even close to the global meat industry, which is worth over $700 billion, but still, it's something. The problem is that investment did not last for very long. And not because the tech doesn't work.
Now, we've been hearing how excited some scientists are about all of the opportunity, the potential of lab-grown meat.
Fast forward to now, and investment into lab-grown meat has fallen quite a lot. Like last year, we only invested about $40 million into it. That's 17,500 times less in lab-grown meats than what the meat industry is currently worth. So what happened? Well, the short answer is that investors realized that it's just not very profitable in the short term. Now, this points to the big problem with capitalism in general. And when I say capitalism, just to be very clear here, I mean using the profit motive to decide what we invest in with our resources as a society, instead of, say, voting on it. So it's profit that decides our investments, basically. Developing lab-grown meat technology is a long-term, high-risk play when it comes to profit and returns. It takes years of research and development before you can bring a product to market at competitive prices. But in capitalism, investments have really short timelines. For example, the venture capital companies that invest in startups need to show profits to their own shareholders within just a few years. And that timeline is just too short for lab-grown meat projects. But okay, just as a thought experiment, let's say that a private company, for whatever reason, had continued to invest in lab-grown meat. Enough money so that we'd see this tech working on a global scale. That would be great, right? Well, there's still an issue to consider. I think it's reasonable to assume that this investment would then come from some huge corporation or someone like Elon Musk. I mean, he's one of the few people who has enough money to try a long-term risky play like this, and he's the only guy who seems to care about his image enough to want to be the savior of humanity. But that means when we finally do get the technology at scale, it would be privatized. It would be patented and controlled by a corporation that would want to maximize profits. The point is, even if private investment would develop lab-grown meat tech, which it very likely won't, then it wouldn't benefit everyone who maybe can't afford it because the company still needs to profit. This is exactly what Kelly warns Lacella about. We can have all the tech in the world, but if it's developed inside a system that prioritizes profit over abundance, that technology will be controlled and restricted by those who benefit from scarcity. I know it's kind of complicated, and it's also a tangent anyway. I go over this in that previous video I did on the Orville here. It has something to do with something called artificial scarcity. Although warning, if you do decide to give it a watch, I mispronounce scarcity a lot. But okay, so what do we do then? How do we get lab-grown meat technology to work on a global scale without private investment? Well, public funding, of course, which we're not doing. As it stands, and this is true for most countries, Private investments driven by profit are controlling the biggest industries in our world, like food production. And that means it's also limiting new ways of feeding our world. The point here is that we aren't missing lab-grown meat tech just because it's not profitable in the short term. It's also because it wouldn't be good for the industries currently profiting from factory farming. And so both the development and the use of this tech is very much being suppressed by the industry. For example, the meat lobby is fighting lab-grown meat with full force so they can keep profiting from factory farming. And it's working. Take the Real Meat Act of 2024 in the US. It was introduced in 2024, and it's all about prohibiting federal funds to support the production and advancement of lab meat. That includes things like conducting or even supporting research on this. Yeah, good call, meat lobby. Let's not spend our public funds on tech that would actually make the world a better place. Also, multiple US states have straight up just passed laws restricting on what cultivated meat can be called. In Missouri, for example, it's illegal to label anything as meat unless it comes from a slaughtered animal. Which is kind of funny, I guess, in some twisted way. The meat industry that lobbies so hard to avoid accurate labeling about their own products is the same industry that fights so hard against actually having accurate labeling for cultivated meat. It's completely absurd. Cultivated meat is molecularly identical to conventional meat. But in states like Alabama, Florida, Indiana, Mississippi, Montana, Nebraska, and Texas, they just straight up banned the sale of lab meat. And it's not just a US thing either. In Italy in 2003, for example, they also banned lab meat production and sale. They justify it by saying that it's harming, food traditions and farmers. Italian food is my favorite by far, but come on, Italy, that's a bit of a stretch. And as far as harming farmers goes, I don't think small-scale farmers actually like factory farming all that much. The industry giants like Purdue and Tyson Foods make meat so impossibly cheap, and they price gouge it too, that for small-scale farms, it's just impossible to compete. But of course, that's not what the meat lobby is telling politicians. They have a very different narrative, that it's bad for farmers and all that. And even though politicians maybe aren't that stupid, it's an easy narrative to go along with for a bit of that campaign funding. That's actually a really important bit. So even though most people oppose factory farming, right? No one really votes based on animal welfare issues. We vote, maybe, on the economy or immigration or the environment in some lucky countries. And politicians, they know this. They know they can keep ignoring public opinion on factory farming because it won't really cost them any votes. And then they end up deregulating animal welfare and even giving subsidies to huge factory farming companies instead of, say, subsidizing smaller farms that do focus on animal welfare, or subsidizing technology that could solve a lot of the issues that we're talking about here. This is actually also why I wanted to make this video in the first place. The terrible things that we're doing to animals, that almost everyone is against, well, it goes completely uncontested. And probably we're paying for it with tax money too. And part of the reason why is because we don't talk about it enough in politics. Right now, a lot of the discourse around animal welfare is tied to changing people's consumption habits. And in some cases, although I think this is way overblown, even shaming people for what they eat. But most of us actually already have the values in place. We've just been disconnected from using those values to guide how we live. And basically that's because profit-driven corporations impose their will on public funding through lobbying. That's capitalism, baby. So while I think it's important to talk about veganism and consumption too, I mean, boycotts have real power. Well, I also think there's a crucial thing that's missing from the movement right now. And this is where we finally get back to the Calvon Sioux. I know you probably forgot about this whole bit during my long ramble, but here we are. Ed and Kelly are still stuck in their Exhibit Sioux apartment, and it's not going too well for them. Let's just say some old marriage stuff is coming up.
Hey, you want to not do that, please?
Yeah, you should try eating in the morning instead of drinking. It's neat.
I'm doing something that the Germans
have been doing for centuries, yes. You love that one, don't you? Well, guess what? You're not German.
But while this is happening, the crew of the Orville have been trying to figure out how to help them. With Ed and Kelly gone, Alara has taken command of the ship as acting captain, and her first instinct is to go and rescue them. So she calls up Union Central to get confirmation. But then her boss says this.
The Caliban are a very technologically advanced race, and they view any species at a lesser technological level as inferior. In the way a sentient being might view an animal, we do not want to engage them in any way.
But what about the captain and the commander?
Lost in the line of duty.
That's of course very disappointing to Alara, but at first she reluctantly accepts this. But the crew hates her for it, and they make it clear. How can she just go along with orders and leave Ed and Kelly to their fate in the Sioux?
If the captain were in your shoes, he would have gone after you. He would have risked his career to save your life. You suck.
It's a hard position for Alara to be in. I mean, she actually agrees too. She wants to save them, but she got direct orders. But hearing Gordon, well...
Can I have everyone's attention, please? I have been given a direct order from the Fleet Admiralty to abandon the search for Captain Mercer and Commander Grayson. But as far as I'm concerned, they can bite me, because we're going anyway.
And boom, just like that, we're past the point of no return, and they all get together and hatch a plan to rescue Ed and Kelly. So the plan goes like this. Alara can't just go to the Caliban alone and try to reason with them. They obviously don't want to discuss with any old species like Alara's. But it turns out that the Caliban don't see the Kalon people as inferior. And luckily, there's one aboard. So Isaac, yeah, this guy, he's kind of the key to all this, to open the door to a real discussion with the zookeeper. And so he goes with Alara to Caliban. They manage to make it to the planet, and when they do, they go to the zookeeper. But unfortunately, he won't listen to Alara.
You want me to talk to her? Is this a joke?
I know it is absurd, but if you will indulge me momentarily, I would be most appreciative.
But because Isaac is there, the zookeeper lends an ear.
Okay, why do you run this zoo?
So our people may view different species in their natural habitats.
What if I were to trade you something that would be far more valuable to you? Something irresistible.
And then in classic Orville fashion, she offers him some reality TV. The Bachelor, Duck Dynasty, Keeping Up with the Kardashians. Keep in mind, this episode is from a few years ago. And yeah, the zookeeper takes the deal.
There must be 10,000 files here. What is this? Reality television? The best exhibit we've ever had.
Okay, at first this may seem a bit anticlimactic, but that's how the crew, Alara and Isaac, finally managed to free Ed and Kelly. Now, you might be thinking, what exactly is my point here? What does this have to do with factory farming? Okay, so it's an analogy, right? And in this analogy, Ed and Kelly are the animals, or, any of the other issues that we could solve by ending factory farming. The crew is us regular folk, and the Caliban are those who make the decisions, politicians and corporations. So, think about how the crew finally managed to actually save Ed and Kelly. That's actually a good blueprint for how we might end factory farming too. The first thing they do is they organize. At first, everyone is angry with Alara, right? But they manage to get her on the same page with them. The second thing they do is they come up with a good plan to get Alara into a position where she can actually make a deal. In the Orville, Alara then offers a trade and frees Ed and Kelly. Now, we have the power to do the same. We can organize and then pressure politicians by offering them a trade as well. Our votes for ending subsidies to factory farming giants, actually putting regulations on the horrible practices, and that includes price gouging, and of course, subsidizing technology like lab meat. Now, this is almost certainly going to trigger some people watching right now, especially in the US, where voting is pretty limited to 2 parties. Listen, I know this system is messed up. I'm all for an anti-capitalist or even spiritual revolution. But as history has shown, we've actually made real social progress when we organize and we pressure the top. And if you're not convinced by a sci-fi show, and I don't blame you, I'll give an example from our own history. Yes, I've decided to put a history segment at the end of a 40-minute video. But hey, we started with the future, right? So back in the height of the British Empire around 200 years ago, the British economy basically ran on slave labor. Slaves were necessary to the economy and society in general, and it was pretty much the main reason for British global dominance. And slavery was insanely profitable, just like factory farming is today. Of course, today we look back on slavery as deeply immoral, but in that time, it was normalized with arguments that we would probably find kinda horrible with today's standards. And anyway, as the historian Rutger Bregman points out, for most regular folk in Britain, it was also just very far removed from their daily lives. Again, like factory farming is removed from our lives, even though we might be against it. So how did they end slave trade back then? Well, a few people started organizing and building a movement, and honestly, it was just a few. The Quakers, for example, was a group that tried to get everyone to boycott slave-grown sugar and cotton, just like the meat boycott movement today. But they also took it a step further. They were really politically engaged. As Bregman writes, if you go through the archives of that group today, you'll mostly find to-do lists and action plans. These guys were pragmatic. Bregman calls them pragmatic revolutionaries, and they spread their wings far. For example, they got this one guy, Thomas Clarkson, on their team. Kind of a crazy guy. So after learning about the horrors of the slave trade, this dude literally traveled over 35,000 miles on a horse to hand out pamphlets and gather petitions. It took him 7 years. But he got the job done, and he was key in helping organize the Brits from the bottom up. And eventually, together with the Quakers, he helped found the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which in 1807 then helped end slave trade in Britain, which we now look back at as insane. The point is, I think we're really close to seeing something like this with factory farming too. And that's why we need to keep talking about it, or start talking about it if you haven't. And the great thing about organizing around an issue like factory farming is that it solves so many issues at the same time. I mean, just take your pick. For me, it's, animal suffering, but it could be the bad health effects, potential pandemics, workers' conditions, antibiotic resistance, or the environment, of course. The little pressure that's already been applied by organized movements has already led to improvements as well. And that pressure can be as easy as just signing or even drafting a petition or calling your local reps to voice your opinion. Or even easier, just keep learning and keep talking about it. As Bregman writes, many activists think you have to hold on tight to your highest ideals, but sometimes you have to aim lower if you want to hit your target. Both the future of the Orville and our own history shows that our moral circle is always expanding, but it doesn't happen by accident. It happens because people refuse to accept the normal, the natural, and the necessary status quo. It's time for us to campaign, organize, and make future generations a little less embarrassed if we survive. Thank you kindly for staying with me until the end. And remember to go check out Planet Wild at the link below, which both helps the environment and animal welfare directly. The first 100 people to sign up with my code Marcus3 get their first month for free. And it directly supports me to make more videos like this. It's really a win-win, so go do that.